Professor Michael Zweig is a renowned emeritus professor of economics and founding director of the Center for Study of Working Class Life in SUNY Stony Brook, where he received the SUNY Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching. His path-breaking books, which are also his past books, with the exclusion of the book that this particular interview is going to concentrate on, include Religion and Economic Justice and the Working Class Majority, America's Best Kept Secret. Welcome to the Kiros Report, Mr.
Thank you for having me. Good to be with you.
A pleasure. So let's get on it. But before that, a few things about the Kiros Report. The Kiros Report is supported by the Hutchins Center at Harvard University, and also previously supported by Berklee College of Music, in which I was a professor of philosophy for the past 15 years. It is my honor and also an occasion to develop a working relationship with Professor Zweig, to welcome him to the Kiros Report. The book that I'm going to concentrate on to focus the interview today is his renowned and highly acclaimed book with a beautiful cover. It's really beautiful. Class, Race, and Gender: Challenging the Injuries and Divisions of Capitalism. The book is wide-ranging. The narrative style in the Hemingway tradition is clarity, transparency, courage, and honesty, virtues that I personally admire as a professional philosopher myself. It has many scintillating chapters, which invite you to read them. Because they're done so well, full of data, full of insights, and full of original ideas. So I will not be doing justice to such a splendidly rich book in one particular episode only. That is too ambitious. So I'm going to butcher the themes of the chapter, but I'm going to isolate one or two, maybe three imperative cultures that the episode should work with. So why don't we begin with what you say about yourself as an activist scholar, which reminds me of the habits of the great Walter Rodney, who, like you, was an activist scholar for the Caribbean imagination. So I want to know more about your activism, what you did, what you attempted to do, what you realized, what you did not realize, the triumphs and the challenges. Let's spend about 10 minutes or so fleshing that out beyond the book.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kiros, for your very kind words about the book and about my work. I have been active in trying to address social justice issues since I was in high school, which is quite some number of decades ago. I am a first-generation American. I'm the first person in my family born in the United States. Whoops. I'm the first person born in the United States in my family, and English is not my first language. German is my first language. And my parents and my brother came in their arms to America to get away from Nazism, to get away from the Holocaust. And they survived. Many in my family did not. And I was raised with a knowledge of the Holocaust and with a knowledge of America as a refuge from that barbarity. And in 1955, Emmett Till was lynched in Mississippi. And his mother famously arranged for an open casket funeral so that people could see the terrible damage that was done to her son. And I saw those pictures, and I saw that this was happening in America. I had heard in my family of people being burned and tortured and beaten and murdered, and that we had come to America, my parents and my brother, to get away from that, and that America was not that. But here it was in America. And Emmett Till at that time in 1955 was 14 years old. I was 13 years old. And so when I saw those pictures and I saw what that was about, learned what that was about, that was the opening of consciousness in me that we can't have this in America. That it's just not permissible. I mean, it isn't that it isn't American, it's just not permissible. It is obviously American in part because here that kind of thing happens. But I became motivated at that moment to do what I could to rid this country of that kind of work and that kind of activity and that kind of experience. And so I became something of an activist. And in 1960, when the civil rights movement began, the modern civil rights movement, student movement began with the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, with those 4 students who sat at the lunch counter in a Woolworths. There were Woolworths protests all around the country to oppose Jim Crow segregation. And I was a freshman at the University of Michigan, and I joined in those protests, in those marches, in those demonstrations, and those picket lines to put a stop to Jim Crow in America. And I was also concerned at that time about atomic nuclear annihilation of the planet. There was the Cold War going on. There was a great fear of nuclear war. And I had been involved even in high school in opposition to those nuclear threats. And so those 2 elements, the question of nuclear annihilation and war, and the question of civil rights and racial justice, animated me to activism. But I was also a student. And I, with many other students at the time, wanted to know more about what was really driving these problems, that it wasn't just enough to say, oh, we don't like this, so let's put a stop to it. Well, what is it that's driving this so that we can target our activism appropriately and effectively? And that required study, that required learning. Now, we didn't learn too much in class about that question, but we learned among ourselves. We had study groups and we read books and we read articles and we debated and we went to different forums. And that combination of theory and practice is what I developed with so many others in the student movement at that time, to find out not only what is actively required to change the world, but also how is the world working so that what makes it happen, so that we can effectively target that activism. So now there was this sort of, you might say, walking on 2 legs of theory and practice, and that the theory was one element that would guide the practice, but the practice was also providing us experiences that we had to really think deeply about, from which theory could be derived. So that was that, as I say, walking on 2 legs of theory and practice that I developed from a very early part of my activism in studies. And I've been keeping that on for, well, I don't know, 60 years since then. And here we are, I'm still active in doing things with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, still active in the anti-war movements and now in the movements of Gaza. And also then thinking about these things and writing and continuing to do political education in relationship to the lessons of our experiences running up to today. And the book, Class, Race, and Gender, challenge the injuries and divisions of capitalism is my attempt to express what I've come to understand out of that experience of movement building, but in relation to an intellectual investigation of what it really means, and then how does that guide further practice. And I wrote this to be a resource for young people who are coming up and being activists in DSA or in Justice Democrats or in the Sunrise Movement or wherever they are, Black Lives Matter, Me Too. We're all dealing with different elements of the capitalist system. And so we need to understand how that system works and how it is that it generates these issues and these outrages. And that's what I'm doing, and that's what the book is for.
Incredible, splendid. I did not think it would be otherwise, because the book is so riveting. Now, you and your colleague, Professor Eric Wolf, write quite a bit about the notion of class. But I'm still not satisfied with the conceptual clarifications that have been given about what class is yet. So this is my desperate attempt to challenge you to give us a specific, juicy, as it were, and intelligible understanding of what class is in the Marxist tradition.
Well, let's set aside the Marxist tradition as a point of reference, and let's set aside those categories, and let's look at, as a focus of our attention, the material world and the material experiences that people have in life in a capitalist society in order to explore what class means.
Excellent.
Now, in the question in this country, in usual political parlance and in the commentariat, this is a middle-class country. We have a broad middle class, and yes, there are rich people, and yes, there are poor people, but those are at the fringes. There's at the margin, at the top and the bottom of society, rich and poor, but most people are in the middle. And certainly if you consider income as the foundation or the basis of class, or wealth as the basis of class, you can draw lines of who are the poor, who are the rich, and then what's in the middle, and you can draw those lines where you want, and it's generally somewhat arbitrary. I don't think that it's helpful. Obviously, you can define class that way. Many people do, and you can get somewhere with that. But for me, the question of class is a question of power.
Yes.
And power that arises in production. Class is at its foundation an economic category. Okay. But it has political and cultural and social and artistic implications. Yes. But those, including, of course, income and wealth, which are implications of power, but they aren't the foundation of class. The foundation of class arises in the productive process, where some people control that process for their own benefit and mobilize a broad population of people to do the actual work. Now, that's true in every society, not just capitalism. That was true in feudal society, it's true in slave society, it's true in tributary societies. There's all kinds of ways in which that set of relationships can be organized. But at the core of it is some people do the work at the direction of others who take the product of that work for themselves. And that's also something that we could call exploitation.
Correct.
Where some people, but what exploitation is about, we can talk about exploiting resources and exploitation of the environment. That's a different use of the term exploitation. But when I'm talking about it in relationship to class, class arises when some people do the work of production and other people take that product for themselves and their own purposes.
Yes.
Now, if you understand class as power, you have to immediately recognize that it's a question of a relationship, because power is in its essence a relationship. Income is not, or wealth is not. You can say, how much money does somebody have? And you can say, all right, that's how much they have. But you can't say somebody has power without saying somebody doesn't. Or that somebody is relatively powerless compared to the people who do have power to organize and control production. So when I talk about class, that relationship is a relationship between the working population or the working class who do the work under supervision and direction, but without a whole lot of power over the content of the work, the pace of the work. But they have direction, which is given to them by people with power, and that's the capitalist class. That's what a capitalist does, is it organizes and mobilizes the resources for production. And so what you have here in my way of thinking is the foundation of class is in that power relationship that arises in production. And we don't have a direct measure of power the way we have a direct measure of income. You can look up how much income somebody has or some group of people have. You can look up how much wealth is in the bottom 10% of the population or the top 10. You can't look up power that way. So what I've done in my work is to look for a proxy, look for something that stands in for power. And I found that the best measure, the best thing to look at is occupation. So if you look at people whose occupation involves going to work without a whole lot of control over the pace or the content of the work, under supervision for somebody else who's employing them, that's the working class. Now, in American cultural history, the working class is often thought of as lunch bucket workers going into a factory that employs 20,000 people. And since we don't have a whole lot of that anymore, a lot of people think the working class has disappeared or it's an old category, it's not interesting. But if we think of class not just in terms of manufacturing or mining or construction workers, but in terms of who's doing the work of the society for the capitalist class that runs that work, now we're talking about call center workers, we're talking about home healthcare workers, we're talking about TV repairmen, linemen for the cable companies. We're talking about, if you actually add up all the work, all the people who have working class jobs, it's about 62% of the workforce. So this is not a middle class country. This is a working class country. And that has political consequences, cultural consequences, and all of that, which I try to get into in this book. But what we have, in my way of thinking, is a working class that's about 62, 63% of the population. And then a capitalist class, that's the top executives, the CEOs, the CFOs, the boards of directors of the corporations in America. That's about 2% of the labor force. If you just add up who has those jobs, how many are there, which I've done. And then there is a middle class. It isn't the dominant class in the country. It isn't the main class, but there is a middle class in between labor and capital. The middle class is not an income category. It's a power category. It's a category of people in the professions, people who are small business owners, people who are managers, who are in between, in that power grid. What is the middle class in the middle of? It's in the middle of labor and capital in one way or another. And that is about 35% or 36% of the labor force. If you add up the number of people who are managers and supervisors, small business owners, and professional people like doctors and lawyers and university professors and so on, you end up with about 36% of the labor force. So I don't know if that satisfies your desire for clarity, but that's where I would start in our discussion.
That's excellent. What you've done quite successfully is to show us the inextricable, as it were, connection between power in the Weberian sense and the way class contributes to it. But I want to go beyond that. In one of your fantastic chapters, which by itself constitutes a book, if you had wanted to do that, you bring in something that is very unpopular in the American parlance, the media presents the idea of class, namely what Marx is particularly known for, with all kinds of problems of measurement here and there, the extraction of surplus value.
That's right.
The point of production, so that we can understand class within that context. It's not merely a description of power relations, although it is in a very important sense, but it is particularly rooted in what almost all of us do not know. That is, when we are advocating for living wages, wage increases, so forth and so on, there is a tendency for us when we're advocating for this, not to understand that we're advocating for them because there is an exploitation that is taking place at a subterranean level that the media would not even dare to go to.
Well, that's right.
How about that?
Well, that's what I was saying before when I was talking about surplus and the development of classes of people who do the work and produce, and then other people who come along and say, well, I'll take that. And that's
Correct.
Now mine. That is the process of exploitation.
Let's flesh that out more clearly.
Okay. Now, again, in this book, I try to do this in a way which is not jargonistic. So I'm not talking about surplus value. I'm not talking about sort of Marxist categories that might be familiar to people with this outlook. But I think it's more useful as a teaching tool to explain what's going on in ordinary terms without having to use the jargon of surplus value. So when I'm talking about exploitation, I go back to its historical origins in human society when people first began to create a surplus. That wasn't always true. People were in subsistence societies, and they produced what they needed, and they lived, and they had children, and the children came forward. And at that standard of living, there wasn't a surplus. Or if there was, like in the Northwest Coast First Nations people in British Columbia and Washington State, before the Europeans came and before the Russians came, what you had was a society that was able to produce a surplus, but nobody took it. They at the end of the year, they had a potluck. They had a name for it. And everybody would have a big party, and they would all sit around and eat up all the surplus. And then, they would go back to work and live their next year. And if there was more than they needed, then they would have a big party and eat it up. Well, along come the English, and they say, wait a minute, wait. You can't just eat up all the surplus like it doesn't belong to anybody. It belongs to all of you. Wait, no. It has to belong to somebody who takes it. And so then the English come in and they prohibit potlatches. They destroy that culture and that way of thinking, and they impose a culture in which the surplus that's created now gets taken by somebody else other than the people who made it. That's where exploitation begins. And that has a long history in human society. We don't need the English to come in and tell us how to do that. People have been doing that for thousands and thousands of years. And it created societies which were based in slavery, in which the laboring population, the producing population, were property. They were owned by a ruling elite that did not do the work, but controlled the work and took the product of the work of the people that they owned. Well, then we had feudal society. It was another way of organizing exploitation, where you had a rural population, agricultural population, but there was also an aristocracy that allowed them who owned the land, claimed the land, and then said to the rural agricultural population, fine, you can stay there, you can grow food, you can even have some of the food, because if you don't have the food, you're going to die, and then I have to go to work. No, you can have some food, but I'm going to take what you don't absolutely need for your survival. And that ruling class, that aristocratic ruling class, used that surplus to build castles and to build pyramids and to build all kinds of things, beautiful painting, beautiful sculptures that they supported. All of that was forms of surplus that were created by people who were doing the work, but not for a wage. They were doing for work because the serfs didn't get wages. Slaves didn't get wages. Rural populations that were dominated by marauding tribes that extracted tribute, they didn't get wages, but they were exploited. And then along comes capitalism. Now here we're jumping through a whole bunch of historical moments and how this all works. We're not going to, get into unless you want to pursue that. But now you have capitalism, and the form in which that happens is the people who do the work get paid a wage. So now they're free. They can quit. They can move from one employer to another. That's all true. Serfs couldn't do that. Slaves couldn't do that. Workers can do that. And that is an element of freedom that prior working populations did not have. But when these workers get paid a wage, all that wage does is it allows them to go back into the market and buy what they and other workers have produced. But that isn't all that they produce, because they also produce a surplus, which the capitalists in a capitalist society take and can use not just for their better, life and yachts and mansions and huge estates, but now to invest in further production. And so capitalism is a different kind of economic system, but it still has exploitation in it. It still has surplus in it, which is produced by one group of people and taken by another. And that's the foundation of exploitation. It's also intimately, obviously, linked with the power relationships that generate class. And that, I don't know if that, gets to what you wanted to get to, but that's we'll start with that.
That is incredible. And I can only wish, considering the population of the audience that attends to the Kiros Report, I can only dream that each and every human being who considers themselves to be workers understand these intricacies of the way that they are being exploited at the point of action.
Well, that's why they should buy this book and look at it and read it and take advantage of that knowledge to change their political practice to confront this in a more effective way.
Indeed, and you have done a remarkable job in this book. We'll get into it more, and I'm going to invite you again to do other episodes.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
We're just going to do some surface level but comprehensive introduction to the misery under which human beings are living at the moment. Catastrophes, as Cornel West would call them. Now, in one of your books, there is a catchy subtitle. The White Working Class, you say, a well-kept secret.
No, it's the title is The Working Class Majority, yes, America's Best Kept Secret.
That's right.
There is no such thing as the white working class. There are white workers who are part of a working class which is multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-generational, multi-gendered. There is one working class, of which there are white members. But I think it doesn't help to talk about the white working class as though the working class were white. And this is something which I think is very, very important if we start to unpack how race and class are so mutually intertwined in American history. You can't really understand one without the other. They really are mutually determined. And in doing that, in unpacking that, it's so very important to understand and to take into account that the working class is a multiracial, multi-ethnic entity or organism in society. Now, to think of the working class as white corresponds to thinking of Black people as Black. So, right? So a Black worker isn't a worker, right? A Black worker is a Black person.
Exactly.
A woman who is Rosie the Riveter is a woman.
A woman.
That's not a worker. That's a woman.
That's a woman.
A
yes.
real worker, that has to be a white man.
Uh-huh.
Well, you see, that's the cultural environment in which we all grow up. And I think it really is important to understand that a Black worker is Black, but is also a worker. And a white worker is white, but is also a worker. And so if we separate out those identities and hold them completely apart, then we can talk about Black people as Black and white people as workers. But if you understand that these things are mutually determined, then there's no way to understand white people without understanding workers. And there's no way to understand workers without understanding Black people and women and, people from the islands and people from South America and from wherever they are and wherever they come from. It's a unified and coherent class that crosses race. But within race, there are also classes. So in the Black population in the United States, among African Americans, when E. Franklin Fraser wrote The Black Bourgeoisie, in the 1950s, whenever he wrote it, he wasn't really talking about the bourgeoisie in terms of big capitalists. You were in the Black bourgeoisie if you had a job in the postal service.
Yes, correct.
Because you had stable employment, and correct, as opposed to being out in the cotton fields and being a sharecropper. So the idea now in America in 2024, where we are, there is a Black component of the bourgeoisie. Barack Obama is part of it. Michelle Obama is part of it. Oprah Winfrey is part of it. Jay Johnson is part of it. Those people are functioning members of the ruling class in this country. That's something that the civil rights movement made possible. That's something that the civil rights movement created. But at the same time that the Black population was drawn forward in that civil rights movement, class divisions within the Black population were exacerbated through many different mechanisms. And so you have some people in the African American population who have been drawn forward into the ruling class and done very well. Then you have Black people who are in the working class who have been really pushed down with the rest of the working class, including the white working class, in the last 50 or 60 years, so that there is a greater bifurcation and separation in the Black population and in the white population now than there was 60 years ago. And that's the operation of class within race.
Excellent. Now, let me push you further. First, let me congratulate you for a truly brilliant elucidation. But we can go even deeper with the brilliance as a foundation. If what you say is true, and there is no reason for me to think otherwise, it's so compelling, then we'll have to interrogate the conceptual status of the idea of class, race, and gender, which is the heart of your work.
Yep.
The sense in which we can analytically ground the germination of the concept of class in what you elucidated, the extraction of surplus value, at least in tradition.
Yes.
Whereas we can't apply that rigor to have a conceptual understanding of both race and gender because we have nothing to ground them on other than illusions. Because anthropologically, the idea of race has been deemed as nonsensical. It is merely an outside mask, as it were, that the human self wears when it finds itself inside what we call race, skin color, shape of lips, eyes, all these nonsensicalities. We can also go a step further and interrogate the idea of gender. I have made a modest contribution myself in 2 books, Self-Construction and the Formation of Human Values, and also recently, Self-Definition, in which I interrogate the meaning of gender. Particularly if we take what Butler and others have recently contributed, namely that race and gender could simply be linguistic performances. We do them sufficiently habitually to begin thinking that they are real, which we cannot do with the idea of class relative to what you have elucidated. So let's interrogate both race and gender.
Well, that'll be fun. So I think that, as you say, class has a profound material foundation.
Correct.
In the actual material construction of surplus and its taking. That
Correct.
is why we can talk about it with a straight face, like there's really something there.
Absolutely, as you did.
You are correct, I believe, to say that race is just a made-up category. The problem is that it isn't just made up arbitrarily. It's certainly in American history. We all understand that there was slavery in the United States. Mm-hmm. Except maybe some people in Florida aren't so sure that it was an important thing. But basically, we all understand that there was slavery in the United States. What is often overlooked is a point that Ted Allen made in 1975 and then elaborated in a couple of important books. And it wasn't just slavery, it was racial slavery. That the British imposed racial slavery in the later part of the 18th century, in the later part of the 17th century, in the 1670s, 80s, and then into the 18th century. The British imposed it in order to divide the working population, which was in rebellion against them in the colonies. And that, what Ted Allen was able to do was find the historical foundation for that claim. So that this racial distinction played a very important part in the burgeoning process of exploitation in the New World, in the colonies. Mm-hmm. So people had to learn to be Black, and they had to learn to be white.
Be white, correct.
I came to America, my parents came to America in 1938. After World War II, my brother and I, my father could then get gasoline, and from Detroit we could go to look at America. And so we would sit, my brother and I, he's 5 years older than I, and we would sit and look at maps of the United States. This is where we are. Oh, let's go here. And we would point to a place, and it was Louisiana. Or let's go over here, and it would be South Carolina. And my parents would say, no, we're never going there. And we're not going there because we would then have to decide if we're white or if we're colored. And that is not a question which is real. That's not a legitimate question. That's a question of oppression, the same way that we were asked in Austria, are we Jewish or are we Aryan? Can't have that. So we had to learn that we were white, because the society makes us white. I am a white man. There's no question about it. I don't particularly feel like I want to be or am white in the social sense because I don't accept that category. I don't accept that relationship. Now, I remember having a conversation with Charles Mills, who was a Black philosopher also. I think he recently passed. Was at Northwestern. Very important philosopher of race and class. And he talked about how coming from the islands, he, I think, came from Trinidad and from the University of the West Indies, going up to Canada to get a PhD. But he passed through America and spent some time in America. And he said he had to learn that he was Black. Never occurred to him that, I mean, he obviously knew that he was Black in the sense of his skin color. But what that meant as a social phenomenon was something that he didn't understand at all until he came to America.
Correct. Me too.
Yeah, I don't want to say it, but I'm not surprised that you're saying.
An Ethiopian who in
Yes.
my culture would be considered handsome.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
yes.
you look pretty good to me. So,
Oh, so do you.
so what we have going on here is a cultural consequence of class, which is the creation of race as a category, again, of power. If we understand class as income or class as what do you have on your bureau as cultural artifacts, those are markers of class. But if you just have them, then you can't understand the relationship of class to race and gender, because race and gender are also gradients of power and relationships of power. So the advantage, or one advantage among many, of understanding class as power is to understand its relationship to race and gender, which are also elements of power. So, you know, we can say, well, race is just made up, so let's just get rid of it. Let's just shed it. The problem is that it has such a powerful presence in the society as an instrument of class power. So to say, let's get rid of race is to say, let's weaken the power of the capitalist class and strengthen the power of the working class. Indeed. Now, there's a reason why the people who are promoting the most racially charged and racist approaches to voting rights, to education, to all range of cultural and political and economic questions. There is a reason why those people who are the most racist in that dimension are also the most dedicated to the free market and to capitalist power. Those things go hand in hand. Indeed. So if you say, let's get rid of racism because it's just a construct, what you have, and it's true, but it's a construct that has the power of class domination built into it. And so the struggle against racism and against white supremacy is intimately bound up with the struggle against the power of capital. So, and the same thing is true for gender issues and gender equality and all this abortion issues. These are all questions of the control of women on behalf of capital and the culture of capital. And so to challenge the domination of male supremacy is to challenge the domination of capital. Now, those things are related, but they aren't identical. Correct. So you can have a discussion about let's go take after the boss and still be racist. And, oh, we don't want black people in our union because they're dirty and we don't like them and they don't belong in our union. The union is only for us, white people. But we're all against the boss. Well, you may be against the boss, but you don't understand what the boss is doing by making you think that you only have to have a white union. That's the boss's work. That's right. So if you really are against the boss, you have to pull down that white union local and make an integrated union. So those are the kinds of questions that have to be brought forward. And the same, the opposites or the other side of that is also in the Black population. Black freedom cannot be accomplished without white participation. White supremacy, and I think I have it expressed this way in a book, I'm not quite sure. White supremacy will be around until white people put it down. White supremacy is a problem for white people.
Yes.
And I think that it's still in all a problem that Black people then have to come with white people and figure out how to engage white people in that struggle. And not just say white people, that's the white devil. I was at a talk that Malcolm gave at the University of Michigan in 1963. And when I sat in the front row in the student union, and there was Malcolm talking about the white devil looking at me. And I'm thinking, no, that's not right. That's just, you can say all these other things about, Black oppression, all that, but white people are not the devil. Some white people are your enemy, that is true.
Correct.
But let's be careful here. And actually, Malcolm, after that Hajj in 1964, changed his mind about that.
Indeed.
And that was a very important step forward in his understanding. Not too long thereafter, led to his assassination. And the same thing with King, who started to understand the economic consequences of racial division and the nexus of economic and racial, class and racial issues in power. And, not long after that, the man was on underground. Well, these are very dangerous ideas, this stuff about racial equality and gender equality, because they are challenging. See, we can think that they're just figments of the imagination, but they, in that sense, not real the way that exploitation is real and class is real. But they aren't just figments of the imagination that you can just wake up from a dream and say, oh, that was a dream. Because these things are reinforced time and time and time again by corporate power, by capitalist power. And so you can't separate these things out. They are material forces, even though they're only figments of the imagination.
But you see, what you have done for me, Professor Zweig, is in this book, not only have you elucidated truly originally through a critical lens the interrelationship between race, class, and gender, with one having clear material foundations and the others contributing to the material foundations, or rather the material foundations to be real, precisely because gender and race have that kind of materiality, however limited it may be. Then you flip it, because there is a difference between a critical understanding of how these three categories work together for the emancipation of humankind, or what you called human happiness, which is different from the way that the bourgeoisie is using race, class, and gender, not as instruments of emancipation, but as instruments of continuing what I called the illusion. Your book does this truly successfully. You show us sides of the issue.
Thank you. That's what I was trying to do.
Yes, and you did it quite well.
I appreciate that.
Educated.
And I just think that these are the kinds of questions and the kinds of understandings, again, that young people who are coming up, who are active in these various social movements, who are outraged by the society that's around them. But what is driving that? What are we really talking about? What's the material basis of the power relationships that we are in the middle of? And what supports those power relationships and what undermines them? What challenges them?
Indeed.
As the subtitle is, challenging the injuries and divisions of capitalism. which
did
we're
it
all
very well.
doing. But to
You did
challenge them, you have to understand this nexus of class, race, and gender.
indeed, indeed. You did it very well. Now,
Well, thank you.
for the last 10 minutes,
Yeah,
if you don't mind, I'm
please.
overlaboring you. Some of our colleagues, one of whom is an admirer of yours, would like you to think a little more on why the labor movement continues to attach itself to the Democratic Party instead of separating itself from the Democratic Party and become the voice of reason, the voice of emancipation.
Well, that's a long and complicated kind of question, and there is a history in the United States of labor parties. And most recently, the Labor Party that was founded in Cleveland, Ohio in 1996, I believe, the founding convention, 1,400 workers from unions across the country, including my union. We had, I think, 11 people from faculty and professional staff at the State University of New York went to Cleveland to help found the Labor Party, including the president of my union at the time, Bill Scheuerman. And it didn't really work. It dissolved after about 5 or 6 years because the labor movement, even though there were a lot of unions who were present among those 1,400 workers there in Cleveland, the labor movement was so tied to the Democratic Party that independent political action was really impossible. And it's, I believe, still is impossible.
Yes.
So in this book, Class, Race, and Gender, that I've written, the first 2 chapters are about politics.
Yes.
And I dismiss, with this history and talk about this history, dismiss the prospect of third-party politics in the United States as being a proper avenue. So for me, the question is how to work in the Democratic Party.
I see.
And of course, people then immediately roll their eyes and say, what are you talking about? Work in the Democratic Party? It's a bourgeois party. It's run by the Wall Street. And it's true. We live in a society that's run by Wall Street and the bourgeoisie. So you don't escape that if you go outside. So to me, what we need is a force within the Democratic Party, which already there's nascent elements like the Progressive Caucus that Congresswoman Jayapal from Washington State and AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez here in New York, and Jamal Bowman and other people who's now no longer in Congress. Those people and the social movements that they come from, it seems to me, have to coalesce as a coherent, persistent presence inside the Democratic Party to take it over the way that the Tea Party took over the Republican Party, the way that certain, you might think, how do we get the environmental movement, the labor movement, the women's movement, the Black liberation movement, all these different movements, social movements, to work together to understand their common interest in challenging the power of capital? Because that's what we're all doing in our own different particular ways. So bring all that together into a coherent force inside the Democratic Party that runs candidates, but persistently and consistently runs candidates and generates the kind of enthusiasm that Bernie Sanders generated. Now, it's true that Bernie Sanders got crushed by the Democratic Party elites. He didn't want it. And so they made it impossible, really, for him to prevail over Hillary Clinton in 2016 and then in 2020. But we shouldn't just walk away from that. Now, to me, the political process has 2 elements. Again, walking on 2 legs, if you want. One is movement building, and one is running candidates and having people in office. If you want to affect policy, you have to have people ultimately in places that make policy, and that's Congress, local elected officials, members of Congress, senators, all that. You have to have people in those positions, but you won't get those people in those positions without social movements. So that is the second leg, is there's the social movements that are bringing forth policy issues, they're bringing forth leadership, and they're bringing forth a base that can bring those leaders that are brought up out of those movements into elected office. But now what do they do there? Well, now you're in an arena where the bourgeoisie really runs rampant.
Yes.
And so you need to have the most intimate ties back to your social movements to strengthen you and to allow you to keep going and to win re-election and then extend your base beyond your, South Bronx and a piece of Queens that AOC has. Let's go to Eastern Kentucky. Let's go into Arkansas. Let's go into Alabama, and which Bernie Sanders did. And guess what? He found a lot of support there. Well,
Correct.
We ought to be following that up, the labor movement in connection with these other movements in what Reverend Barber for the Poor People's Campaign calls fusion politics.
Yeah.
A fusion movement of all of these different forces that understand each other as allies in a united struggle against corporate power.
That's excellent.
Now that's within the Democratic Party. So you're not asking the labor movement to step away from the Democratic Party,
but to revolutionize it.
But to transform the Democratic Party. What does it mean? And to have that out inside the labor movement, which is also a question of how do you organize and do you organize and how do you mobilize for a strike, or do you strike, or do you even want to strike? Those are the kinds of things, for example, that Sean Fain from the UAW is a leading light, in my view. It's a very important presence inside the labor movement, but also making ties to other social movements. That's what I'm trying to do in my union, inside the labor movement, and the work that I'm doing in the Central Labor Council, the Long Island Federation of Labor, where I'm a delegate. So, we're trying, but it's really, really hard.
I appreciate it, and I think this theme is to be continued. I can imagine with your cooperation and availability to devote an entire episode to the labor movement.
I'd be happy to.
I think we will consider that, and I'll send you the invitation at the appropriate moment. I must say this. I'm humbled and educated by you. I'm so grateful.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Lift up the book so people can see the book.
Yes, of course.
So they can see what it is. You talked about the wonderful cover. There it is, Class, Race, and Gender. And it's a very nice cover.
Beautiful cover, beautiful cover, beautiful book. And
very good.
Beautiful cover. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. It's
and
a pleasure
please
to be with you.
introduce the Kiros Report when the episode comes out, distribute it widely.
Yes, well, send me the link and I will certainly do that.
Please make my television program to be the voice of the left.
Well, I appreciate it's an excellent opportunity and very, very important work that you do.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Have a good night.